Okay, the next item on the agenda or public input is Arishpreet Bulla from Auckland University. And so Arishpreet, come on up. And over to you.
Kia ora, guys. Okay, looking good. Thank you guys for this opportunity, first off. And yeah, my name is Adashpreet, and I'm a Part 3 civil engineering student at the University of Auckland. So yeah, today I'm just going to be talking a bit about infrastructure and intensification, and more specifically, kind of infrastructure theory and how to optimize it. Yeah, so this is our breakdown right here. We'll be going through around 3 main points. Centrally, just infrastructure theory, and then looking at intensification and how we can optimize it for our society, and also some of the additional nuances of today. Yeah, so in terms of infrastructure, I think it's pretty clear that we kind of run into a problem very often in Auckland where we tend to over-optimize in our procurement phases and over-plan. And then when we get to our execution phases in terms of construction, we kind of fall short. And when we fall short, we kind of take away from some of the production that we can actually do. So there goes a lot of issues that go unaddressed. What this essentially does is, when these issues go unaddressed, they still have to be addressed eventually because that's just the nature of the infrastructure projects, right? And then when we do that, we take away from other infrastructure projects. So our overcommitment to certain projects, it just kind of ruins other projects. And then we kind of get stuck in this loop, right? We first undercommit and then we overcommit. And then we do the same with another project. So we're just kind of putting ourselves back around 20, 30 years in terms of large projects. One example that I like to bring up is the Reeves Road flyover, actually. The Reeves Road flyover was a very successful project, right? Finished ahead of time, was under budget. However, we did see that there was a congestion problem that occurred, especially around Pakuranga Road and Tirakau Drive. I mean, the issue here is we had the solution at hand, right? We can just reinstate the third lane that was converted into a bicycle lane. And I don't mean this to offend anyone, but we did see a lot of people complain about stuff like induced demand when we don't know how specifically it can even be applied in this context. The first thing to note is that when a brand new flyover is open, it already serves the purpose of helping the community optimize their routes to, stuff like work, transport, just like stuff like that in general. The demand is already at maximum at that certain point, especially when it initially opens. Saying that an additional lane would re-induce and kind of induce more traffic seems like kind of counterintuitive, especially considering that we're already at maximum capacity. Now, this was a pretty common sense change that we could have done very early on, and it could have been done in its inception phase, but we fell behind, and yeah, it kind of tanked us for a couple of months. Another, project that I like to bring up is Mill Road. This is a project that I've studied immensely, and yeah, it went through a lot of iterations. It's a decades-old project, went through different cabinets, different governments, and I think it took away from some of the production that we could have actually done. We inflated from around 600 million to maybe 1.5 to 1.6 billion, and then later on now we have to cut it down to stage 1, stage 2. So broadly speaking, intensification is obviously a really good initiative for our city, especially considering that we do pay for the rest of the country's fees. But I think it's very safe to assume that our current society isn't fully ready to include this change into our daily lives. So the true question is, how can we create some incentives to kind of enforce and have a kind of cultural shift for our society to become more open to the idea of 20 apartment complexes, 20 stories? I think one of the most effective changes here is actually creating zonal exemptions for schools. By doing this, we kind of market to the middle class in the sense that, okay, now they have an opportunity to have a wealth creator for them, through their children, having the ability to access some of the better secondary schools throughout the city. And if we provide them with zonal exemptions, I'm 100% sure that these apartment complexes will sell out first, and they'll sell out immensely fast. This is kind of the things that we want to do with intensification too, right? Making sure we have people that are actually willing to buy instead of just being another sunk cost infrastructure project. So there's been a lot of talk about, the rates cap and how to kind of work around some of the fees that we currently have. The truth is, in Auckland, we have a vast range of social services, right? We have public health care, our transport is subsidized to some extent. There's a bunch of other stuff too. Realistically, enforcing a rates cap whilst keeping our social services available, even including pensioners and beneficiaries, it just isn't a realistic solution. At the same time, it's very true that we can't just have a constantly inflating rates. Considering we could reach to the point of France, for example, who I think had like a 47% income tax rate whilst they had like record high inflation and GDP decline. We do have to kind of get creative with our solutions here too. I mean, it seems kind of antithetical, I suppose, but kind of putting ourselves in a position where we have the ability to invest on our long term, invest in our future, I think it could be one of the best ways to actually take on and kind of cover the rate speed that we're trying to actually limit here. An example would kind of be maybe even taking on more debt, just building more, just building, you know, build over the next 30 years, even if it means we have to like hike our rates temporarily, having the ability and having the leverage to kind of create a long-term pipeline for our infrastructure would help to ensure that we have some insurance late game. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, also just talking about, I mean, again, no offense to anyone particularly, but when we're talking about infrastructure, transportation, engineering, stuff like this is something that requires an immense amount of time put in, a lot of commitment in terms of your mental load. You know, you have to be really studied in this field. Sometimes I see, you know, like a lot of like politicians and stuff talking about it, but they like study like social services at university and stuff, you know. I mean, those are like very viable degrees, but if we're talking about infrastructure, which is very theory heavy, you know, like I'd like to point out the induced demand example again, we shouldn't kind of limit ourselves to just be elected government officials that are the ones who make these decisions. There does need to be some bureaucratic process for this. And yeah, I guess, I mean, I haven't talked much about what we're actually like trying to achieve here, but I think having the young people at the forefront, you know, AUSA also presented alongside us. I thought they did a really well job, you know. Having the young people be invested in this is very important. So yeah, I mean, if I've convinced any of you, you know, pass me on to some of like the better voices and, you know, we can sit down and chat, because at the end of the day, this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, questions? Daniel?
Look, thank you. I didn't hear all your presentation. I came partway through. Apologies for that. But boards of trustees, the funding for the student doesn't matter where they come from, but in relation to the building budget component for the school, for that student's enrolment depends on where on the student actually living in zone. So I think that creates an immediate disincentive for allowing for out of zone enrolments, because the school doesn't get the budget component, as though the building component for that student. But with respect to, and I have sympathy for the problems that a rates cap would create, but what message do I give to my low income ratepayers who are very constrained in terms of their disposable income, if we are just literally dialing up rates because of a concern about the need to have more cash to pour into the suite of projects that you're referring to?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think your concerns are very valid, right? I mean, it obviously tends to hurt the lower income earners even more. And again, I think it's very true that having a constantly inflating rates cap is just, it's not very realistic, especially if we want to serve our community, right? So, I mean, I agree with you that we can't have our rates cap or like our rates just constantly hiked. But at the same time, we do need to have some form of sacrifice somewhere. We can't have both at the same time, where we have these immense amounts of social services, infrastructure investment, whilst also having these like rates being kept. So I guess it's about picking and choosing. And again, I think it's like there's like a lot you can do. You know, you can kind of make some of the process more efficient, have better investment in some places. But again, like I think it's like a very like lengthened out discussion that we'd have to have around this. But I think generally speaking, rates shouldn't be constantly hiking. So I'd say like I'm in favor of just like taking on more of a deficit, more of a debt budget here, just to kind of offset some of the pressure from rates.
Okay, thank you. Alf?
Kia ora he mana. Sa sri akal, Adasprit. I'm going to ask you questions around the maximising the value of intensification slide. In the first two paragraphs you got, will cause efforts to be inefficient. I want to have a look at those inefficiencies. The second paragraph had to create incentives. My question is, in your third paragraph, are some of those incentives you referred to in that second paragraph included in their example, creating zonal exemptions for students living along train corridors? So sorry to ask those questions, but I just wanted to go through to what are the inefficiencies that you referred to in the first paragraph.
Yeah, so in terms of inefficiencies, I mean, I think the biggest one is that Auckland as a city, we're just not ready for high-rise apartments, even like greater townhouses, especially considering we are a like single-family household kind of city so far. We do live in suburbia, and we do have this notion that this is like our dream as people who are in the city. And that's not to say that there's like people that are completely against, living in apartment complexes and stuff like that. There definitely is people that are open to the idea, but it's about how can we be smart with our decisions, right? We have the opportunity to create larger incentive for people to move into these apartments, so the demand is actually created too. I think so far we've seen that there has been like a lot of kind of, not necessarily failures, but we've fallen short with some of the aspirations that we have with our projects. And I think just being extra cautionary and taking those measures that are needed for incentives to be created, I think it's very important that we have that discussion.
Just an answer to your third paragraph,
Oh, yeah,
creating
sorry.
those, what other sort of incentives are you looking at? Is that third paragraph part of what the answer is to your second paragraph around?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's all I wanted to find out. Is
Oh, yeah, sorry.
what other incentives?
So in terms of other incentives, I guess creating some form of community building tools, having recreational centers set up within these facilities, providing access to some other like abilities, like libraries, gyms, stuff like that. But also another thing that we've been looking at is because I'm going to assume that our aspirations are centered around creating these intensified buildings around major train lines, right? Providing potentially concessions to these people to allow them for travel, freely from the city to the apartment complexes, offsetting some of the prices that they'd already pay. It can save up to around $400, $500, $600 per person, essentially, especially if you look at the university changes, right? And spread that across like an entire family who have 2 people working, 2 children going to school. We're saving essentially around $3,000 per household per year. So I think that is like one potential incentive.
Thank you. Okay, no further questions. So someone like to move to acknowledge and receive? Thank you. Moved Richard, seconded Alf. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, mate. Thank you very much for popping along. Okay, item 7 is local board input. There is none, and so we will now adjourn this meeting. We will go to a governing body meeting, briefing, and at the conclusion of that